Sign it over to Marcus, the house, the accounts, all of it, or I will make sure you never see that baby." My mother-in-law was standing in the kitchen doorway in her silk robe at 7 in the morning, holding a cup of coffee like we were discussing the weather. I was 8 months pregnant. My ankles were swollen. I had been up since 4 with back pain. And Eleanor was telling me to sign away everything my husband and I had built together, or she would find a way to take my child. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I set down my glass of water, looked her in the eye, and said, "Good morning to you too, Eleanor." That was the moment I understood who she really was. Not the polished woman who'd hugged me at my wedding, not the grandmother-to-be who had wept at my baby shower. The real Eleanor, the one who had been quietly calculating since the day I married her son. Let me back up. My name is Serena. I'm 31 years old. I'm a CPA, a certified public accountant, which means I spend my days reading financial documents the way other people read novels, line by line, looking for what doesn't add up. It's a skill I never thought I'd have to use on my own family. I met my husband Daniel at a work conference in Chicago 6 years ago. He was in corporate finance. I was presenting a session on estate tax strategy. We argued about amortization schedules over cheap hotel coffee, and I knew within 20 minutes that I was in trouble. We dated long distance for a year. I was in Columbus, he was in Denver. Then he moved. We got engaged on a Tuesday, which he still insists was spontaneous, and I still insist was planned, because he'd asked my best friend Carla for my ring size 3 weeks earlier. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Asheville, North Carolina. 60 people. String lights. My mother cried during the vows. Daniel's mother wore white, I noticed. I didn't say anything. Eleanor had money. Old money, the kind that came with family portraits and opinions about which fork to use. Daniel's father had passed away when Daniel was in college, leaving Eleanor in control of a trust that was structured, I would later learn, in a very specific way. The principal distributed upon Eleanor's death, split between Daniel and his younger brother Marcus. Marcus was 38, never married, lived 40 minutes from Eleanor in a house she paid the mortgage on. He called her every day. He drove her to her doctor's appointments. He was, in Eleanor's words, the devoted one. I was, in Eleanor's unspoken opinion, the woman who had taken her devoted son to another city. Daniel loved his mother. That's important to understand. He didn't see what I saw because he had spent his entire life not seeing it. Eleanor had a gift for warmth in public and cold precision in private, and Daniel had learned somewhere along the way to only remember the warmth. We found out I was pregnant in March. Daniel was so happy he actually sat down on the bathroom floor. We called our families that night. My mother screamed. Eleanor said, I assumed this would happen eventually, and then pivoted to asking whether we planned to move closer. We didn't. We were in Columbus. Our life was in Columbus. Our house, our friends, Daniel's job, my practice. Eleanor was in Scottsdale, Arizona, 4 hours away by plane. She did not take this well. The calls started. 3-4 times a week, always to Daniel, always ending with some variation of, your child should know their grandmother, or I just hope you're thinking about what's best for the baby. I could hear her through the phone sometimes when I was nearby. The tone was soft, concerned, practiced. Then in June, she suggested we spend the last month of my pregnancy at her house in Scottsdale. So I can help, she said. You'll need support. Serena's mother is so far away. My mother was 2 hours away, actually. Eleanor knew this. Daniel thought it was a good idea. He framed it as a kindness. I didn't want to go, but I was tired of fighting about his mother, and I thought, 1 month, the baby comes, we go home. We drove down in late July. Eleanor had set up the guest room with new linens. She had a list of doctors in the area, a meal plan for my final trimester, a whole system. I should have recognized it for what it was. I was too exhausted to think clearly. The first 2 weeks were fine. Superficially fine. Eleanor was attentive to the point of suffocation. Always nearby. Always with an opinion about what I was eating or how I was sleeping or whether I was walking enough. But she was kind about it. Generous seeming. Marcus came over for dinner every few days. He and Daniel would watch baseball while Eleanor and I sat in the living room, and she asked me careful questions about our finances, what was the market doing, whether we had updated our will since getting pregnant, what our plan was for the house if something happened. I'm a CPA. I know when someone is doing due diligence on me. I started paying closer attention. I found the first document by accident. I was looking for a pen in the small desk in the hallway. Eleanor had told me to use it whenever I needed, and in the top drawer, underneath a notepad, was a folder. Inside was a draft amendment to the family trust. I only had 30 seconds before I heard Eleanor coming down the hall, so I photographed 2 pages with my phone and put it back exactly as I found it. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I read what I'd photographed. The amendment proposed adding a clause that would redirect a significant portion of the trust distribution, conditional on Daniel's having a child before Eleanor's death, to Eleanor's discretionary control, for the benefit of the grandchild's upbringing and stability. In plain English, if Daniel had a child, Eleanor could claim control over money that was supposed to go to Daniel directly under the justification of managing it for the baby. It was dated 4 months earlier, before we'd arrived. Around the time Eleanor had started suggesting we come stay with her, I didn't sleep that night. I didn't town down the next day either. I needed to understand the full picture before I said anything. I've seen what happens when people confront too early, before they have the documentation. The accused reframes, the evidence gets buried. The person who raised the alarm ends up looking paranoid. So I kept my face neutral, and I kept paying attention. The morning Eleanor told me to sign over the house and accounts was 2 weeks into our stay. She had apparently decided the slow approach wasn't moving fast enough. I had walked into the kitchen early because I couldn't sleep, and she was already there. She didn't preamble, she laid it out like a business proposal. If Daniel and I transferred our joint assets into a family LLC, which she and Marcus would co-manage, she would ensure the baby's future was protected. If we didn't, she would consult her attorney about grandmother's rights and seek a custody arrangement for the child after birth. I want to be precise about what happened in my body when she said that. My hands went cold. My vision sharpened. It was the exact opposite of panic. It was the feeling I get when I'm reviewing a balance sheet and something is wrong and I suddenly know exactly where to look. I said, "I'll talk to Daniel." She said, "Don't upset him. He's been under enough stress." I went back to the bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time watching Daniel sleep. He looked so peaceful. He had no idea that his mother had just threatened our child. I made a decision. I would not tell Daniel yet. Not because I was hiding something from him, but because I needed 48 hours and I needed him to behave naturally around Eleanor while I gathered what I needed. If I told him now, he would confront her, she would deny, and the document in the drawer would disappear. I texted Carla, not about everything, just that I needed her to call me at a specific time with a reason I had to leave the house alone. Carla is quick. She texted back in 3 minutes. Done. The next morning, Carla called. Emergency. With a mutual friend? Nothing serious, but I needed to come help. Eleanor watched me with a perfectly still expression as I apologized and said I'd be back in a few hours. Daniel offered to drive me. I said I needed a little time to myself and kissed him and left. I drove to a FedEx office 2 miles away. I called my attorney. I have a personal attorney because, as I said, I work in finance and I believe in having one. And I described the trust amendment and what Eleanor had said to me. My attorney, whose name is Deborah, was very calm and very focused. She told me 3 things. First, grandmother's rights in Arizona are extremely limited and would not apply in any custody arrangement for a child with 2 living married parents who had done nothing wrong. Eleanor's threat was essentially empty. Second, the trust amendment I'd photographed was potentially relevant depending on whether it had been executed, and I should try to get more of it. Third, I should document the conversation from that morning as precisely as possible in writing with a timestamp. I sat in the FedEx parking lot for 45 minutes writing out everything Eleanor had said, word for word, as close as I could get. I emailed it to Deborah. Then I drove back. Over the next 3 days, I was very, very quiet. I helped Eleanor make dinner. I watched television with Marcus, who I had decided to treat as a neutral party for now, even though I suspected he knew about the amendment. I asked Daniel about his childhood, got him talking, gave Eleanor nothing to react to. I was the gray rock in that house. Completely unreactive, a surface that offers nothing to push against. On the third day, I found what I was really looking for. Eleanor had a home office she kept locked, but she'd been in and out of it more than usual and had left it ajar one afternoon when she went to take a phone call in the garden. I had maybe 4 minutes. I went in. The executed amendment was in a red folder on the desk. I photographed every page, 12 pages total. I also found a letter, printed, not handwritten, from an attorney in Scottsdale, addressed to Eleanor, outlining a strategy for protecting the family estate from asset dissipation in the event of marital dissolution. It referenced Daniel by name. It referenced the due date of our baby. They were planning for our marriage to fail, or planning to help it fail. I photographed everything. I walked back out, pulled the door to the same angle it had been, and went to the living room and picked up the book I'd left on the side table and read 3 pages without seeing a single word. That night I told Daniel. I didn't soften it. I didn't cushion it or frame it carefully. I pulled out my phone and I showed him the photographs, and I sat next to him on the bed and I let him read. It took him a long time. When he looked up, his face was something I hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, more like the expression of someone who has been navigating by a map that just turned out to be wrong. He said, "She asked you to sign over the house?" I said, "Yes. 3 days ago. I needed time to get the documentation before I told you." He was quiet for another minute. Then he said, "Show me the letter again." He read it twice. He set down the phone. He said, "I want to call Marcus." I said, "Not yet. Let me call Deborah first." He looked at me. I said, "I've been working with an attorney. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I needed to be sure." He was quiet for a moment. I watched him decide how to feel about that. Then he said, "Okay, call Deborah." We called her together on speaker, sitting side by side on the guest bed in his mother's house at 10:45 at night. Deborah walked us through everything methodically. The executed amendment was significant. It had been filed with the trust's attorney, which meant it was likely already in effect. We would need to challenge it. The letter from the Scottsdale attorney suggested a deliberate campaign to influence the marriage, which might be relevant in a civil proceeding. And the verbal threat Eleanor had made to me was documentable if I was willing to testify. I was willing. Deborah advised us to leave the house the next morning before confronting Eleanor and to consult with a trust litigation attorney in Ohio before taking any action. She also advised Daniel to send Eleanor a brief written notice that we were aware of the amendment and were seeking legal counsel, so there would be a record. Daniel drafted the message himself. He wrote it and showed it to me. It was restrained and clear, and I saw in it the same precision I had always loved in him, the way he could separate what he felt from what needed to be said. We packed that night quietly after Eleanor had gone to sleep. We were in the car by 6:30 the next morning. Daniel sent the message to his mother at 6:45 when we were 20 minutes down the road, so there would be no confrontation at the house. My phone started ringing at 6:48. Eleanor. I handed it to Daniel. He looked at it for a moment, then placed it face down on the center console and kept driving. His phone started ringing at 6:51. He didn't answer either. We didn't speak much for the first hour. I watched the Arizona desert go by and felt the baby move and put my hand on my side and thought, "We're going home." Daniel broke the silence somewhere near the state line. He said, "She asked you to sign over the house." It wasn't a question. He was still processing. I said, "Yes." He said, "And she threatened custody of our baby, yes." Yes. He was quiet again. Then, "How long have you known something was wrong?" I told him about the folder in the hallway, the photographs, the parking lot, all of it. He didn't get defensive. He didn't say I should have told him sooner or that I should have trusted him to handle it. He just nodded slowly, looking at the road. After a while, he said, "I need you to know I had no idea." I said, "I know." He said, "I've been not seeing things about her for a long time." I said, "I know that too." The trust litigation took 8 months. Deborah connected us with an attorney in Columbus named Frank who specialized in exactly this kind of case, a beneficiary challenging an amendment made under potentially coercive circumstances, with evidence that the amendment was part of a broader scheme to redirect assets. Frank was methodical and relentless, and the kind of person who seemed to genuinely enjoy finding discrepancies in legal documents. He found several. The amendment had been filed without the co-trustee's signature. Daniel's father had named a third-party institutional co-trustee, a provision Eleanor had apparently never intended to use and had tried to work around. The filing was procedurally defective. This alone was enough to challenge it. Frank also deposed Marcus. This was where things shifted. Marcus, it turned out, had not been as comfortable with the plan as Eleanor believed. He hadn't known about the visit strategy, the deliberate timing of the invitation to Scottsdale. He had known about the amendment but had assumed it was routine estate planning. When Frank showed him the letter from the Scottsdale attorney, with its language about marital dissolution and asset dissipation, Marcus sat very still for a long time. Then he said, on the record, that he had not authorized any plan involving Daniel's marriage, that he had not known the letter existed, and that he would not contest a challenge to the amendment. Eleanor's attorney tried to walk it back. It didn't work. The amendment was voided 8 months after we left Scottsdale. The trust reverted to its original structure. Daniel and Marcus each retained their equal interest in the principal to distribute on Eleanor's death without her discretionary intervention. Eleanor did not speak to Daniel for 4 months after we left. When she finally reached out, it was through Marcus, a message relayed secondhand she wanted to meet the baby. Our daughter was born in September. We named her June because Daniel had proposed on the first warm day of a cold spring, and I had always thought that particular quality of light in late spring was the most beautiful thing in the world. Daniel replied to his mother's message himself. He told her that the door was not closed but that there were conditions. She would need to acknowledge in writing what she had done. No attorney's language, no misunderstanding framing. An acknowledgement. She sent the letter 6 weeks later. It was 2 paragraphs. It was not effusive, but it was direct and it was signed. We met her for lunch in Phoenix 8 months after June was born. She held the baby for 20 minutes. She didn't say much. At one point, she looked at me across the table with an expression I still haven't fully decoded, something between regret and the particular pride of someone who has met a worthy opponent, and she said, "You're very careful." I said, "I am." She nodded once, like that settled something, and looked back at June. I don't know what Eleanor and I are now exactly. Not close, probably never close. But Daniel has his mother, and June has a grandmother, and the architecture of those relationships is built on something honest now instead of something concealed. That has value. I've learned to account for things in terms of what they actually cost, not what I wish they'd cost. The trust is intact. Our house is ours. The documents are filed correctly, and every morning I sit at the kitchen table with my coffee and my daughter in her bouncer beside me, and I think about that parking lot in Scottsdale, 45 minutes alone with my phone, and Deborah's calm voice on the line. And I think, that was the moment I decided I wasn't going to let someone else's plan become my life. Some things are worth every minute of work it takes to protect them. June is worth everything. I still think about that parking lot sometimes. The Arizona heat coming off the asphalt, my hands shaking just slightly as I held the phone. Deborah's voice steady on the other end. Nobody was watching me. Nobody knew where I was. And in that moment I had a choice. I could drive back to Eleanor's house and pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen, or I could decide that protecting my daughter was more important than keeping the peace. That choice didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of training myself to look clearly at things that were uncomfortable to see. When you work in finance, you learn fast that the most dangerous documents aren't the ones people hide in safes. They're the ones left slightly out of place in a hallway drawer because someone got overconfident. Eleanor had been operating on the assumption that I was too pregnant, too tired, too emotionally invested in the family to look carefully. She had mistaken my quietness for blindness. Those are not the same thing. I think about what would have happened if I had told Daniel the morning after I found that first folder. He would have confronted his mother. She would have locked the office, moved the documents, and told him I was hormonal and suspicious, and I would have had nothing. The outcome of that story is not the outcome of this one. What changed it was discipline, the willingness to sit with what I knew and wait until I had enough to act on it. That's harder than it sounds when you're 8 months pregnant and living in someone else's house and watching them smile at you across the dinner table. There's something I've come to believe, not because anyone told me to, but because I've watched it play out in my own life and in the financial documents of dozens of families. The people who cause the most damage are rarely the ones who lose their tempers. They're the ones who plan quietly. And the only real counter to that kind of threat is your own clarity, knowing what you value, knowing what's actually happening, and refusing to be rushed into decisions that benefit someone else. Daniel had to do his own reckoning with all of it. That part was his, not mine. I couldn't hand him a clean version of his mother. I could only show him the documents and sit beside him while he read them. What he did with that, the way he wrote that message at 6:45 in the morning and placed his phone face down and kept driving, that came from something in him that had always been there. It just needed the truth in front of it to activate. June is almost 2 now. She has Daniel's eyes and my stubbornness, which her pediatrician has already noticed. Eleanor held her at that lunch in Phoenix with something careful in her face, something that was not quite remorse but was the nearest thing to it I've ever seen from her. I didn't need more than that. I wasn't looking for a transformation. I was looking for honesty, and that letter, 2 plain paragraphs, signed, was honest. Peace, I've decided, is not the absence of difficulty. It's what's left when you've stopped pretending things are fine and started dealing with what's actually true. I built a life on that parking lot afternoon, not alone, with Daniel, with Deborah, with Frank, with the quiet discipline of knowing my own mind under pressure. That's the only thing no one can file an amendment to remove.